So welcome everyone to this first of a series of webinars, and it's fantastic that so many people signed up to come to this evening. This session is being recorded. You should have had notification about that when you joined. That's so that we can put it on our website, but you will find that your microphones and your cameras have been turned off. Now, just before I introduce you to Pat and Clare, who we're very glad to have with us this evening, I just want to flag up that this webinar, as you know, is going to look at the impact of the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. So you might find some of this is challenging, you might find some of it is difficult to hear. If you do, please look after yourself first and foremost and do whatever you know works for you to bring you back down and ground you again. Remember, every diocese in Scotland does have a safeguarding advisor who's available to you if you need help or support at any time at all. Lord Jesus, we praise you for calling us to the service of others. We pray for a generosity of spirit to ensure the vulnerable are protected. We pray for a compassionate heart so that we will reach out to those who are wounded by abuse. We pray for courage and determination as we seek the safety of everyone in our parish communities. We dedicate ourselves to this work of service and pray that you will help us to do your will at all times and in all places. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Now, I am delighted to introduce our speakers this evening to you. We have Dr. Pat Jones and Professor Clare Watkins, and I will put their bios into the chat, along with links to the document across at the moment and a web page that we have on it as well. But just to share some of their background with you, Dr. Pat Jones grew up in Liverpool and spent 10 years working as Director of Adult Formation in the Archdiocese. She was later the Assistant General Secretary to the Bishops' Conference and then Deputy Director of CAFOD for some years. She was also an auditor at the 1987 Synod of Bishops and a member of the Pontifical Council for the Laity. Latterly, Pat completed a PhD at Durham University on Catholic social teaching in the practice of Catholic charities. And most recently, she was part of the boundary breaking research in the Centre for Catholic Studies, which brought us the Cross of the Moment, exploring the systemic aspects of the clerical child abuse crisis in the Church. We also have with us this evening Professor Clare Watkins, who's the lead researcher on the Conversations, Culture and Communion project at the Centre for Catholic Studies at Durham University. The project explores possibilities for ecclesial culture change in the light of learning from the boundary breaking research into the clergy sexual abuse crisis. Since studying and gaining her doctorate at Cambridge University, Clare's combined raising a family with her husband Guy with theological teaching, research and writing in the areas of ecclesiology, sacramental and practical theology. Clare is also a published author, and next year in 2025, a new book will be coming out, which she has co-authored with James Butler, called Christian Faith and Christian Learning, a Theological Action Research Account.
Let me first of all see if I can share screen. So thanks very much, Helena, for welcoming us. It's a real pleasure for Clare and I to do this, and we're very delighted to be part of the community of safeguarding people in Scotland, even though we're both foreigners from over the border. So I think we have a great deal in common. So I worked on this project for 3 years, and it's been a really important experience and quite a welcome educative experience for me. And in this presentation, I'm going to just pick out some of the aspects of it which perhaps will lead to conversation. When we published the report, in the tablet, there was a short review of it by a survivor. And this is what she said. You can see on this slide here that the report succeeds in creating a space, a non-judgmental safe space in which to express ourselves and have careful conversations around survivorship and safeguarding. And I was really grateful for this quote, because our main hope for the research, and indeed for the work that follows from it, is that people engage in conversations, and that's what we hope we'll do tonight. I'd probably extend this a little bit and say we need to talk about not just about survivorship and safeguarding, though those are huge priorities, but also about the meaning and implications of the abuse crisis. Its meaning extends far beyond the practices which we've come to regard as essential, and it's those bigger dimensions, those bigger horizons, which has been our subject. Just in case it's new to anyone, we're just going to review quickly what the research was about. What we were trying to do was look at Catholic culture and systems and very carefully describe these as implicated in how abuse happens and how the response has often been inadequate, and then to make a constructive contribution to healing and a healthier church. The main strength of our research is the amount of listening that we did in 82 interviews and 4 focus groups. We also did a quantitative survey, which we can talk about another time, which isn't really our subject tonight, but is also valuable. And what was distinctive about it was what we described as a whole church approach. In other words, we were trying to listen to as many of the voices of people affected by the abuse crisis as we could. So priests, bishops, survivors, family members, safeguarding parish representatives, religious communities, lay people in many different roles in parishes. And to stress that, again, that we're not concerned with cases or policy, but with the meaning of the crisis. And this is what we were doing, the process. And in a sense, in what we're doing here tonight, I'm inviting you to do the same process. And possibly it's a process that you already find yourselves doing. That first of all, we listen to all these different voices. And then secondly, we discern and analyze the habits and structures and attitudes and ideas that are implicated in how abuse happened. And those two words, discern and analyze, are important because they're slightly different activities. Discern is in many ways an activity of faith, something that we do with a sense of the guidance of the Spirit and of what somebody that I read today called the canopy of grace, the horizon of the church and its mission that we all live within. Whereas analyze often feels like a more perhaps an academic word, an objective word, and is also part of what we tried to do, to look in a very rigorous and disciplined way at what people were saying. And then to explore ideas from Catholic teaching, which lie underneath all these habits and practices. And this idea we had of untying knots in Catholic teaching. And then last, to try and imagine practical ways forward, which will restore or repair what has been lost or taken away. And you can see here some of the themes. Any of you that have looked at the report will have even looked at the contents pages, they'll be familiar. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can glance at them just as I'm talking. Again, the first column is about our attitudes, our habits, our understandings that we only perhaps discover by reflecting on them. So particularly the idea of being bystanders, that whole question of whether we feel implicated, whether we feel that in some way we've colluded with silencers, with not challenging behaviour, with not asking the kind of questions that may be needed to be asked. So each of those has got a great deal behind it. And then trying to tug out from the habits and cultural patterns, the theological themes that lie beneath, such as the huge theme of what the Spirit is saying to us in the church through this crisis. And crucially, we were seeing those affected as including not just the individuals who are victims and survivors, but also the whole parishes, the communities that are affected, the priests who are affected, the bishops who are affected, the religious communities, to understand that this crisis has affected huge numbers of people. Obviously, victims and survivors always come first, but the other people who are affected too carry burdens of pain and grief, whether it's a priest who finds that his classmate, who he's known for 40 years, has been arrested and imprisoned, or the bishop who inherits a situation that he wasn't even in the diocese when it happened, or the parish community where a priest disappears and they simply don't know, and they have to face questions like, if he is abused, was it somebody I knew? Was it even in my family? So many of the questions that in many parishes that are affected have not been answered. And if there's a running theme, it's this idea that we need to talk about all of these matters and learn how to talk about them honestly and wisely, so that we can do what a theologian I was reading today, Brueggemann, calls transformative listening or emancipatory listening, that our humanness, our capacity to grow and be real depends on us being faithfully heard, he said. And that's why these conversations are important. And we took a great deal of inspiration from Pope Pope Francis's line at the beginning of one of his documents that to move forward, we need a continuous and profound conversion of hearts, attested by concrete and effective actions that involve everyone in the church. I mean, each of those phrases is so crucial. This is about conversion, not just policy change or new practices. It's about what happens in our hearts and our understanding. And it has to lead to concrete and effective actions. And it's all of us. We're all responsible for it. And so the focus question Claire and I are working around is, what do we learn from listening to survivors and others directly affected by the abuse crisis? And what meaning can we find in this experience? And we come with what we've learned from the research, but we know that you too will have done listening, and you will have perhaps probed for yourselves the meanings to be found, the deeper questions that emerge. And that's why we hope the seminar tonight is a conversation. We're as interested in listening to you as we are trying to tease out some of what may be useful from our research. So what I'm going to do is just pick out 4 or 5 quotes quite quickly. And they're quotes that for me became absolutely crucial. We had, I don't know, maybe 20,000 pages of data. We had a vast amount of data. And we read interviews, 82 interviews of about 30 or 40 pages each, over and over again, and coded them and analysed them by theme. Yet, despite all of that rigor and systematic approach, very often there is one line or one part of what somebody said that orients, catalyzes, organizes the reflection that we do on it. And so I'm just going to pick out a few of them that pick up for me, that point to the kinds of conversation that we need to have. And the first one is this, and it sticks in my mind a great deal. This was a man in his 70s who'd had a life with it, had a lot of illness, been abused as a teenage boy. And he said, I get by, but it's not by any means I'd say there's certainly happiness that's in it, but it's not by any means a fulfilled life. It's a reminder that even when we have sorted out all our policies perfectly, even when we have our practices right, we live in a community in which there are people still carrying this grief and sadness and diminishment. And it's always and still our responsibility to work out how to accompany, how to listen, how to learn. So for me, this is a kind of little lodestone to remember that when any member of the church, indeed any member of our communities and our society, our particular responsibilities in the church, any member of the church is not living a fulfilled life, then we need to look at the reasons why. The second one is this, which anyone who's read the report will probably find. And this is again a survivor who was in his 60s or 70s, again abused as a young boy. But for him, what was worse or as bad is what's happened since he's tried to disclose, where he talks about how the secondary psychological abuse is the power of the institution and how the institution treats you, how it ignores you and doesn't want to know you. He says it's sometimes harder to deal with because you're not just up against something that's happened a long time ago. You can process that, you can come to terms with it in your head. But this secondary abuse tends to stay with you, and it's harder to deal with because it's in your face all the time. As we progressed through the research, we realized that the focus was shifting from how did the abuse happen, which is always a crucial question, but fairly well researched, to why has the response failed so badly? Why have we got it so wrong? And we could hear through a lot of the survivors the question, why is it that this church, which I believed in and which I loved and grew up in, why has this church so failed to listen to me and believe me and help with my healing? And that's a cry that resonates. You could describe it perhaps as a lament. It's a great sadness and it's a great challenge. And it's one that we are still in the process of meeting, as is well acknowledged by the Pope and many other people around the world. But it's also a very difficult one because this is an area where, and I hope I'd be delighted if there are some survivors among us today, where everyone has different views about the right next steps to take. And some people want to express anger and challenge and campaign, and some people want to be reconciled and in dialogue and mutual understanding. Some people want all of these things. So we live in a messy situation where people have very different needs, and all of them are valid. All these paths are valid. And so we have to learn the ways that, the variety of ways that will respond to the different needs that will somehow restore not just the primary abuse that happened, but also the secondary abuse that comes from the failure of response. My third quote is one I find extremely poignant. This was from a woman in a parish where a priest had been imprisoned after abuse, and the parish only found out by reading in the local newspaper. And she'd been a lifetime active member of the church. She was a leader. She actually had experienced physical abuse and neglect as a child, but that was in her background. She'd still lived an incredibly faithful life in the church. And she said it would have been good to have somebody come and explain to the parishes that had been sort of damaged, what had gone on. But it was what you'd come to expect, that you're not really told anything. And you'll find out when and if you need to. I find this so distressing, this quote, because it's such a sadness that we haven't worked out how to engage all the baptized, all the lay people in the church, and treat us as adults who are competent to know, competent to respond well, competent to find the compassion and guide the church towards the justice that is needed. It's a kind of, I hesitate to use the word abuse because it's such a serious word, but it's a misuse of who we are and of what we can be. And it points to so many issues that we need to change, the silences we need to break, the relationships that need to be different, the communication that we need to learn how to do. One of the phrases that comes to mind from this quote is that when this happens, it's both an injustice and a wound in the whole community. And as yet, we've done little to gather expertise on how to develop good practice in parishes that have lost a priest or were a priest that has served them that they later find out has abused. We're still at the foothills of that learning journey. And we need to ask the questions such as, why is it like this? Why are the expectations so low? Why don't we know why can we not find ways to be far more honest with people? And the fourth quote I want to highlight is one that, more than any other, set the direction for the report. And this is a guy whose experience of what we've called mishandling was particularly grievous and particularly painful. I can't go into his story in any detail, but he had been actively disbelieved, prodded, he said, by a priest saying things like, "Are you sure you aren't imagining it?" It was a very distressing story. And this is not just in the past, this is within the last decade or so, and even through the years in which ICSA, the National Inquiry, was going on. And he said quite sadly, almost in passing, "I just thought a wrong has been committed. There must be a process of where right is done." And even 5 or 6 years later with the church, I thought the same, like a fool. This is another terribly sad perspective to encounter. But what it pointed to for me is this real sense that what we're about here is justice, that a wrong has been committed and we can't undo it. We cannot take away the fact that abuse has happened. But that wrong has been consolidated by wrongs in the process. And if wrong has been done in the process of how we've handled it as a church, then we have to find a process of where right is done. And that led me in particular to a set of ideas that are summed up in this phrase, restorative approaches, where we try and look at the different models of how we can do something to mend and restore relationships, not between the survivor or victim and the abuser. That's a much more complex matter and not within ordinary expertise, but restorative approaches for the breach in relationships and the failure that's happened between survivors and the body of the church. And that's all of us, not just the authorities. So we look in the report at different models of restorative justice, truth commissions, truth and reconciliation commissions, and healing circles. Spaces in which people can ask questions and receive answers, where harm is acknowledged and crucially, accountability is accepted. And these can happen alongside legal processes and redress. They're not an alternative, they're a complementary thing if we plan it in the right way so that it can happen in a way that so that these processes talk to each other. And of course, it must be victim-led and trauma-informed. But that idea that we need to focus on where right is a process of where right is done is really an example of how the insight of a survivor, quite a simple insight, shapes the whole output of what we were doing, shapes the whole vision that we built as a result of our listening. And then just a couple of other quotes, just to illustrate the variety of ways in which different people in the church are affected. We interviewed several bishops, and this is a bishop talking about his conversations with survivors. And he said, "Only I could say to them, I have no right to expect this from you, but you have every right to hear from me that I ask your forgiveness. You have a right to be asked for that forgiveness. We have no right to expect it, but that has to be done by the church, and within the church." And this one always strikes me very poignantly because we need to work through the question of whether an apology works or not. There have been many apologies from bishops, from the Pope, from bodies in Rome, and sometimes they're repeated over and over again. Sometimes they land, sometimes they make a difference to survivors and communities, and sometimes they don't. And we need to understand why. We need to understand what makes it authentic, what makes it real, and what is the right way to go about doing it. Because, as the bishop says here, anyone who is a survivor of abuse in the church has a right to hear, to be asked for their forgiveness. And for some, this has not yet happened. One of the things that was striking about our research was that, in contrast with what happens when bishops speak collectively and publicly, where they often sound quite formal and it's often a statement arrived at through consensus and voting, whereas when they were able to speak anonymously in the confidentiality of a research interview, they spoke with deep personal engagement and huge humility. And this is a quote from another bishop where he says, "If we're incapable of empathizing and feeling compassion to those who present themselves in pain, then what on earth is happening? The heart of the church is a crucified Lord, and our response has got to be one that stands at the foot of the cross, like Our Lady, weeping at the foot of that cross. You don't stand to the side, dispassionately making theological observations. You run to the foot of the cross, and you grasp at the foot, and you kiss it. And that's the proper response to suffering, not dispassion, but compassion." And I hope you can sense in that quote that this is somebody who really cares. This is somebody who really got through to the survivors that he listened to, because we heard testimonies from both sides. And it helps us to see again that if we can open up spaces for honest conversation, where people, whatever their status or role or office in the church, are able to talk from deep conscience and faith and humanity about what's at stake and what happens when we listen and what we really feel, then I believe we will find the ways forward. That we'll find dimensions of healing that are not possible in any other way. And then the last one, this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but this one's very short. And it was an idea that we picked up from Archbishop Scicluna, a key advisor to the Pope who's handled a lot of the most difficult cases. And it was a dialogue he was having with a moral theologian. And he just used this simple phrase, accountability is redemptive. And again, that's been a bit of a signal for me that's carried on through the research and since, that we have to get to grips with ordinary accountability at every level of life in the church. We have to get to grips with the kinds of practices which work for us. And I hope in the report we outline some of the theology which might underpin that. Most of us in our professional lives, or if don't have those professional lives, we know about others do, find systems of accountability built into what happens as their normal. So we can do this. But most importantly, I think there's this idea that if we do that, we will be better for it. We will gain from it. It will be part of what redeems us from the failure that in some ways we all participate in. So for me, this idea that not only that we have to tackle accountability, and not just as I got here, put it in a code of conduct, which is hugely important, but then take that code of conduct forward and express it in actual practices at parish level. And, you know, I think both Claire and I come not just from the point of view of looking at this as academics, but also as people who are in parish life and diocesan life and organisational life and know what is not there and what is there. So those are just maybe half a dozen of the quotes that, for me, point to some of the big themes and questions. And now I'll pass over to Claire and see what she wants to add.
So first of all, thank you, Pat, for that. And not only thank you for that, but thank you to you and the other researchers on the Boundary Breaking Project, who I think have done such an amazing job in really widening our thinking and deepening our thinking around this whole area of abuse, so that it doesn't just present itself as a difficult problem or even a terrible tragedy in the life of the church, but it actually strangely becomes a moment of realization, self-honesty, and out of that a kind of a hope. I'm not going to say a huge amount. I'm not going to speak as long as Pat, and maybe open up a conversation between Pat and myself with what I am going to say. But I'm going to respond really from my own perspective as somebody coming to this work after the Boundary Breaking Project and after the reports of both the Cross of the Moment and the quantitative report that has been published. And in doing this, I'm using, sorry, that was a mistake. I'm using some images. We've seen some lovely quotes, and I'll be using quotes as well from the people who we heard from in the boundary breaking research. But I've also from a parallel project in Spain. I think there's always been a difficult question about how we use the stories of survivors. And I think there was a very wise decision made by the authors of the Cross of the Moment not to rehearse the stories, to use quotes that were insightful and helpful and opened up windows into experience, but not to tell stories. In this project in the Diocese of Madrid, the Proyecto Repara, they've actually worked with workshops with survivors to develop artistic and craft ways of expressing something of their reality as survivors of abuse. And I'm using those images throughout these slides with permission, though if we do circulate these slides, please don't use them yourselves, don't hand them on without permission from the original source, and the website for that is here. So really what I want to talk about is really just responses to what we've heard from Pat and to the boundary breaking research in general, as somebody who's thinking about the ways in which we need to take the next step after this amazing work. And I want to start with what my reaction was to first reading The Cross of the Moment. And I did it relatively quickly. For those of you who read it or tried to read it or read a bit of it, it is a long document. And it sort of takes its toll on you as well. You know, if you take it seriously and enter into it, I think there are moments which are really you have to kind of stop and think quite deeply before moving on. And again, it wasn't just at the end. Again and again, I found myself asking this question. How did an organization that was founded in and for the command to love one another forget so radically, get so badly wrong what it means to love well? And that for me was the great scandal again and again, whether it was about the occasions of abuse themselves, but perhaps even more so the mishandling and the bystandership and all the other things that are raised by that report. And a sort of, not a despairing, but a growing sense of like, how on earth did we get here? And we were called out, let's be clear, really, we were called out by society, not by our own mechanisms within the church. And so a question that arises, where do I go with this? How can I move on from this in any way that is hopeful and life-giving? And for me, the key was to return to this question that Pat started us off with. What meaning can we find in this experience? And I think it's something that initially I felt almost slightly uncomfortable about, that we should be finding meaning in these terrible wounds and in these experiences of so many people, of course, that haven't disclosed and are still just living silently with these wounds and difficulties. And part of this actually then led me to a point where actually what we need to do is to begin to discern what a response is, because it's clear from the report itself that all that's been heard from survivors, from bishops, from parishioners, from parish priests, all that's been heard can be a moment at which we actually say, what is God trying to tell us? And I was very struck by this coming not just from the writers of the report, who have a section which talks about, the clerical abuse as a catalyst for change in the church, but also from different voices among the participants themselves. And these are just a few of them. I won't read them verbatim. They're there for you to see. But this sense, whether from the bishop who's quoted here, what is God teaching us? The priest who sort of says, this is a really horrible situation, but you know what, this in 100 years' time, we'll look back on this and say this was really important, what we did here. And a woman too, who sort of somewhat hesitantly finds her way to sort of saying, this is really difficult and everything, but you know what, it was necessary because we would never have been able to change in the ways that we needed to change. And all this suggests to me that the cross of the moment and the research that lies behind it is calling the whole of the church community, not just safeguarding officers, not just survivor-led groups, not just priests, not just bishops, but the whole of the church, to increasingly deepen our communal discernment of what the meaning of these stories, these experiences, these great wounds in church life are. Again, not just the abuse, but the mishandling of the abuse. And indeed, around the whole area of the sexual abuse, there is increasingly an awareness, I think, of spiritual abuse, pastoral abuse, emotional and psychological abuse that can go alongside that, but is very much part of the same picture. And I think that's being more and more recognised. This has led me and others, and I think this was very much what Pat was saying in several points in what she was presenting to us, that what we really need to do is to look through the lens of safeguarding and the abuse crisis to beyond safeguarding and beyond the crisis itself and the tragedies there. That what's required is a conversation that takes us into a future which doesn't forget the past, which doesn't forget these past experiences. And of course, let's forget, these are not things that are just done and dusted and they don't happen anymore. Chances are they are still happening because it's a thing that happens in human organizations. And we also know that, of course, for survivors, this never goes away, it's never sorted out. So it's not that we leave our past behind, but what is the way that we can move into the future? The Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, Tutelum Minorum, published for the first time an annual report this year, and it talked about how it saw church communities as having two moments in relation to safeguarding. The first of which is the recognition of the problem and the putting in place of real safeguarding strategies and policies, auditing, regulatory bodies, clear sets of process and accountability. And the second transition, and in many ways, I think we could look at the church in England and Wales and in Scotland and sort of say, okay, so partly through the ICSA report and all the related reports around it, we have made quite a lot of progress in that regard. But as the Justin Welby thing, I think, speaks vividly to us of now, that is not enough. So the second transition that Tutelum Minorum talks about here is that there should be a long-term process, a forward-looking process of properly addressing the aftermath of widespread abuse and the mishandling of cases, the aftermath, caring for victims and survivors, and addressing the impacts on the entire church. I think the cross of the moment calls us into that second transition and does more, because I think it's not just saying that we need to address the impacts of something that's happened in the past, but it's saying we need to learn from that so as to actually become a different kind of a culture, a different kind of a church, so as to, if not entirely prevent these things happening, to actually learn from them in a way that we can actually be a better church, not only in relation to clerical sexual abuse or church leader sexual abuse, but actually to all kinds of abuse and harm and failures to love properly. That question, how do we get to be so bad at loving? How do we get to learn to be better at it? through this experience and through this lens. I've used the language of conversation a lot here, and it's key to the project that's following on from the boundary breaking project that I'm leading on. And I think it's worth to start thinking about this. And I was aware that Pat was inviting us into a conversation in our time together in this webinar, and indeed in the subsequent webinar as well, because it's by conversations, it's by sharing openly and honestly. Truth telling is talked a lot about in the report, that we're actually going to be able to bring about change. Sometimes I think we think, oh, you know, it has to be more than talking. Actions arise, good actions arise out of good conversations. And I'm very indebted here to, again, a kind of secular source around systems change and culture change within human organization. And the idea that conversations are an everyday art form by which we make ourselves together. We need to change our conversations. We need to widen them and deepen them around the themes that Pat has presented to us and has so beautifully set out and discussed and illustrated for us in the Cross of the Moment. And I think it's no coincidence that this human wisdom about change has its deep echoes with the Ignatian and synodal practices that Pope Francis is calling the church into. These are commonly talked about in terms of listening in and for the Spirit, but they have practices related to them. A practice is not just of spiritual listening in a kind of constrained form, but practices of cultural conversation, which is about, you know, that term parrhesia, speaking the truth with courage and openness, not being ashamed to speak it, being able to tell truth, so as to, even when we have different understandings of what that truth is, sometimes being able to tell the truth, being able to share that with transparency and honesty, and knowing that we're going to be safe when we do it, that I can say what I think is true, and I'm not going to be jumped on, I'm not going to be judged, I'm not going to be somehow marginalized in that conversation. And that image of synodal practice that I think gets overlooked very often, it's in the preparatory document of the crowd, that Jesus is surrounded by the crowd and there is nobody in the crowd with whom he will not speak. He is open to the conversations that arise out of the crowd. And I think that's where we need to increasingly situate ourselves as well, as safeguarding practitioners, as pastors, but actually just as ordinary baptized people. That's where we should be doing this stuff. Pat talked about the importance of restorative justice, and I've learned a lot actually from Pat and from the report, and been helped to understand more and more what that kind of might look like in terms of the sort of healing circles and the restoration of proper relationship between people that's needed. But in the light of that, I was struck particularly by the introduction of what I think is quite new language, again in the Tutela Minorum report, which is about conversional justice. That justice, the kind of justice that restores in the wake of this revelation of wound and brokenness, is a justice that requires conversion. And that's not a simple thing. You of course need good structures, you need good policies, but in itself, it isn't going to actually bring about the interior conversion, not only of individuals, but of a culture, of a parish culture, the way we speak to each other, the way we worship together, the way we hold meetings together or not, the way we just welcome each other, or the language we use, is a way in which we can convert a church that seems somewhere along the way as a culture to have forgotten what it is to love properly. Not in individuals. Of course, there's always been proper love in the church, but there's been some serious failings culturally in that as well. And trying to understand what it might be to repair that, to restore that, I think requires the sense of searching for a conversional justice, which will actually lead to a conversional culture, which helps us actually change the way we think, change the way we see things through this painful, painful lens of the abuse scandals. And so the question I would then end with is, so how each of us singly and together to work to enable this conversion of ourselves, first of all, but conversions of each other, those we work with, of others in the church, but also of wider society. I think the church has got a gift, potentially, despite our great failings, to give wider society in this regard. And this is just, sorry, this final slide is just sort of to head up that this is moving forward. These sorts of ideas are moving forward into this next project of conversations, culture and communion, that the details of which are there. But I will stop sharing at that point. And Pat, I don't know whether you have anything that you want to kind of respond to, anything I've said there before we open up for wider questions, or...
Okay, so Claire and I agreed that we would perhaps just chat for about 5 minutes after we'd both presented, so that we could continue this as a conversation. Really, it's as simple as that. We're used to having conversations, and it's how the research proceeded, and it's what we're inviting people to do with the report. Well, I suppose what I'm going to do, Claire, is I'm going to take off the hat of being either a writer or researcher. I'm going to put on the hat of being a member of a parish. And I'm going to kind of challenge us, because I think I'm just trying to imagine in my parish what it looks like to do this. And well, maybe I'm wearing two hats, because you can't quite take hats off like that. It's not that easy.
They're not hats, really.
Yeah, because I was kind of thinking, what are the spaces? I mean, my parish, like I'm sure lots of yours, it's just four parishes that just became one parish. So we've got 4 churches. We've got 1 priest here and 1 priest absent, who might come back, we hope. So we've got a very overworked parish priest and all sorts of things that happen. But it's really hard to find the kind of space in which this kind of conversation might happen. Still less to even get to have a conversation with the parish priest, because he's so busy all the time, and he's busy in a good way. That's not in any way a criticism. We need to understand that. And I've thought about this a lot since finishing the research, because I really think it matters to work out how this plays at the ground level. And that's why I think the role of parish safeguarding reps is so important. I've said to the group in our 4 churches that I would love to just do a bit of reading with them, to read some bits of the report and talk with them. And a couple have said that they would like to do it. I also decided that I had to kind of put my money where my mouth is, kind of thing. So I wrote to my bishop and said, I think we should have a reading group, and I think it would be good for you to be in it. Because I do. I think I think the main thing is to not listen to lectures, but to have some conversations and read it, and for people like bishops and priests and others in leadership roles, because we very carefully use the phrase office holders. They're a very varied group. To sit down with other people and listen. So I suppose the impact for me of the research, quite personally, was I needed to take responsibility to speak out. But I still live in that challenge of what are the right spaces, because I kind of think, we have this thing called parish mission group, which is a bit like a parish council. They have longer meetings than anyone in the parish, because they have so much admin and facilities work and all sorts of things to sort out. And are they the place to start? So I just want to acknowledge that it's brass tacks wise, it's really difficult to know how you actually do this at parish level. And I wondered if you had what your thoughts are about that before we open it up.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And the couple of things I would say, one is that I'm fairly sure that trying to go in from a kind of structural point of view, 9 times out of 10 won't work. So I think, you're right about the parish council, mission council, whatever they call themselves, that actually that's not the way to get these conversations going. I think that the idea of actually, whether it's the safeguarding representatives or actually sort of saying, are there a few people who actually just are interested in doing it in this way, is one of the ways that then the conversation can begin to become part of the culture. And I think what I'm finding in working with the different groups I'm working with at the moment in the last 3 months is that in each group you need to find, and it's only the group, and each parish is different, it's only the particular parish or the particular group that's going to know the right way in for them into how this can happen. And it has to kind of emerge inductively. Now, on one level, that's me kind of getting myself off the hook, because I'm saying like, well, there is no one size fits all. There is no answer to the question you're asking, because it has to be discerned as we go along. And you try things and they fail as well. But I do think one thing that's absolutely key in what you said, and you didn't say whether your bishop had responded or not, and perhaps that's not fair to ask you, but I do think there's something about having conversations across what are often perceived to be bounded social realities within the church. Now, the obvious one is clergy, laity, but it's not the only one. There's also the active members of the parish. You know, we all know, and I've been there, you know, the active people in the parish and the kind of the ordinary people who rock, or the people who only turn up at Christmas and Easter, somehow that makes them lesser. So actually to find ways in which, and I think the place to start is trying to tackle the kind of clergy laity divide. It's very obvious in the synodal process that it's parish priests' voice have not been heard, weirdly, in that process. And I think that's a really key thing. Now, how that is done, I do think there's something about the relationship between the parish safeguarding representative and the parish priest that we need to look at, because that's not, I think it's better than it was, but I think that's often not as great as it could be, and not understood by either party very often as a kind of discerning conversational culture change relationship. It tends to be a little bit more transactional and regulatory. And again, that might be something that safeguard dioceses and safeguarding officers can work with, or that as people like yourself, you know, who can sort of say, well, let's look at this together and see what we can do. But I think it just has to come from inside that group. And the problem is who are the facilitators to make that happen. So it's been 2 parishes been suggested to me in this work to run as pilots for this kind of conversation, and I can go in and see what happens, and it may not work, but that's 2 parishes. And so how do you make sure that this is something that can be, and maybe that's just a way of increasing our safeguarding responsibilities. Sorry, I've said more than enough there. You've had more than 5 minutes of conversation probably now, Helena, sorry.
Helena, do you want to bring in some of the questions?
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm just absolutely fascinated by the conversation that you're having there, and I'm sure it's resonating with lots of people. I have a few people here. One question, a couple of comments.
First of all, thank you very much. Really, really interesting. And I'd seen the document a few weeks ago. It kind of hit me between the eyes when you were talking about people not being allowed to talk and the wider trauma that's felt by communities, because my parish priest was telling me that a local parish priest who was actually known to me this year was arrested on, you know, to do with historical, you know, abuse and so on. And he asked the bishop if he could discuss that. And the bishop said, no, you can't. He said, but I've got people asking me what's happening, you know, how do we react to this? And he said, you know, no, you mustn't. We need to protect people and so on. You know, it's in the news, and I just wondered what your thoughts are on how should a community, you know, who's not as traumatized as the victim, for goodness sake, but who is traumatized that someone known and, you know, held in esteem in their community is accused of something. Of course, they're innocent and so on, but until proven guilty. But if they are, but I just wonder what your thoughts are on you know, that's something that probably happens in more than one place.
Yeah. Shall I start, Claire, and you carry on? Or
Okay.
I mean, I think it's absolutely crucial, and you know, one of the sad parts of, I love doing conversations like this, but you always hear stories of that make you wince, you know, and I think we could all feel it's painful when that happens. It's painful for you, it's painful for the person you were talking to, it's painful for all of us to realize that these kind of failures are still going on. I think there's 2 things. One is I would just, in that situation, encourage people, whether they're priests, deacons, whatever, lay people, to actually say, well, actually, no, I can't do that. In conscience, I can't do that. I'd take refuge in Pope Francis's words about boldness, about speaking out. I would check my own conscience very carefully, perhaps talk it through with a trusted, wise person, and then be prepared to speak. And I say that knowing that I would find it very difficult. But I think I've learned from this research that if we ever let ourselves be silenced, then we are colluding quite badly. And it's you know, that's, the truth is more important than hierarchical respect. Now, the qualifying or proviso is to be very careful to be accurate about where the process is up to.
Mm.
And I think one of the difficulties here is that if this is happening, then you're in a crisis. There's something of a crisis point about it, when really some of this conversation needs to happen earlier in other forums. In other words, I think what we need to do is start having conversations earlier about what would happen if a priest we know disappears or is arrested, or we find out about something. Can we talk about this in advance of it happening, so that if it happens, people already have some background knowledge of what the issues are around communication. Now, sometimes it will be just straightforward, and you think there ought to be communication so that people don't hear it from social media, as they so often do. But I mean, I'm thinking of a parish context where a young priest was arrested. The priests were asked by the diocese not to tell their lay collaborators, but they decided they were one pastoral team, and so they told them all. But they were told by the police to hold on to it until a certain point, until there was I don't know whether there was a trial date or something, and so they did, and they were pipped to the post slightly by social media, but they'd prepared it very well so that they were able to tell everybody in a series of masses on the relevant Sunday. And they did absolutely their level best to respect the collaboration with the lay people they worked with, but also respect the justice process. And it all made sense. It was a very mature parish with excellent relationships that had had a lot of formation work that had gone into it. And so people responded with compassion, with grief, but with understanding, and they didn't feel let down. So, you know, I've learned from the research, it's possible to do it well. It's possible to get it right. It sometimes means checking and challenging the first reactions of some office holders, whether that's diocesan staff or bishops or whatever. But unless we do that challenging, then we won't find the right ways. And then the next thing you realise is that we then don't gather this learning, and that parishes learn from each other, or let bishops challenge each other. I think they probably do, but we don't hear about it because they don't talk about it. So we have to ask them. So, and you know, in my parish, we had a previous young priest who disappeared, as they sometimes do, and I decided I was going to ask. I didn't do it in a public way, but I asked the parish priest what had happened, and he gave me a half answer, which I thought was good, actually. And it wasn't a whole answer, but it was as much as he felt he could reasonably say. And you know, there's a whole lot of stuff here about trying to understand that, you know, he can't say that it was related to an abuse issue, but he can't say that it wasn't, because he doesn't know. So sometimes to be assured even of what you don't know and cannot know is at least helpful. Whereas when there's a veil of secrecy around it, or a blanket prohibition, then people just think things. So I think we've got a lot to learn here, and some of it's basic, ordinary stuff, and some of it's fear still operating. And I think we need more courage.
And I'm not going to say very much, but I can't agree more with what Pat's just said. Absolutely right. And I think that culture of secrecy, which really is very pervasive. You know, I've worked in seminaries, and there's sort of sense that some things just cannot be said, particularly from clergy to lay people, though not only that. Clergy used widely as not necessarily just the ordained. But there's also, for me, the big question. You talked about a parish being mature, and I think there's something about maturity. And there's something to me that when I hear about that culture of silence, it's almost like not respecting the potential for mature response. You know, it's kind of like, well, people will do. And again, what that suggests to me is what we're seeing here is some really poor relationships between people, priests, their parish priest, the bishop, and a lack of mutual trust and respect of our maturity. People, yeah, they get this. Although I do think, the other thing, it would be helpful for people. You made a really good point about the clarity about what stage of process is at. I think most people don't understand what the process is, and I think actually having a clear understanding of what the process is, so that so that we can understand what's going on, and you know that somebody isn't guilty just because they're being suspended pending an investigation. Those sorts of things need to be really clear. But I think, again, those could be part of our knowledge before the crisis arises. Yeah.
Basically, our diocese reacted very badly to the claim for compensation of a young man who had been abused 25 years ago. Anyway, what the diocese did, and it refers to what Pat was talking about challenging, is they did 4 things basically. They informed their insurance society immediately. They informed the police, and they informed their safeguarding committee. They then hid the priest away in a convent, and he was not heard of until the day of the trial. In that period of time, because we don't know, as Pat was saying, nobody tells us anything, we didn't know what sort of interrogation there was, or truth-seeking by the diocese. So they must have spoken to him and asked him, was he guilty? What happened? What are these accusations being put from this survivor? Nothing. I'll go right to the end of this. He was then taken to trial, and the jury, within about 2 hours, came back and said they believed the survivor, not the priest. Within 2 hours. The diocese had him for 2 years and couldn't work that out, and couldn't modify the way that their insurance society was beating this guy down, really depressing him. So overall that, I picked up a quote from American theologian James Keegan, and he says, sin is the failure to bother to love. And that struck me very, very powerfully, because I believe the bishop failed to love this survivor. I did nothing to help him. I even asked him in an email, how have you loved this survivor? And he did not answer. I was trying to ratchet down the rather high tempo or rather accusatory way I was speaking to him, because I did not respect him for all that he'd done. So maybe, Pat, I know I'm rather aggressive at times, but, you know, paresia, being shut down by the bishops. I have been shut down by the bishops. I've been excluded from their email system. They refuse to say anything under a guise of GDPR. I can't talk to you. In fact, the bishop, to my face, when I asked him, did you personally exclude me from the email system? He said, yes, but I can't talk to you because of legal advice. This was after the trial. There's a period where they should have been in contact with this survivor on a one-to-one basis. The fact that he was triggered by people in black with white collars was no excuse for them not engaging a therapist and talking to him. So there's this whole hypocrisy in the Catholic hierarchy, and it's aided and abetted by the COOs of the diocese, because they're all trying to not to safeguard the survivor, they're trying to safeguard the finances of the diocese. Has been happening in America. But there's one guy, one archbishop in America, who has said basically to his insurance society, we'll pay the compensation. And when the insurance society said, no, we won't, he sued this society. So really I'm trying to say is, Pat, you can say, go and talk to people, but quite honestly, I find that my parish, which is a wealthy parish and a well-educated parish, are apathetic. And they're apathetic because the priest does not care. He fails to bother to love.
I mean, again, it's just it's very sad to listen to that, and I'm sorry, because it must be a burden of frustration and anger that you carry, and it shouldn't be like that. I mean, just a couple of thoughts. Without, we can't analyze one situation in the depth that it needs. I mean, I would offer a little sliver of hope. I do think the attitudes of office holders are changing in relation to insurance advice. I think that was a phase that they went through where they were far too dependent, far too inclined to take it. We listened to several bishops who talked quite clearly about how they overruled insurance advice, and I think the mood and learning, certainly in England and Wales, I don't know about the Scottish bishops, the way they've learned, and through being held in the fire quite often, particularly in ICSA inquiries. I mean, the other thing I would say is, in a situation like that, I think it's maybe useful to ask who's the most important person here, and the survivors affected by that kind of failure, ongoing failure, continuing failure, then to see if you can find a bit of the church which will give the right kind of response, whether that's a priest or another office holder, a deacon, a religious, a layperson, anyone, because what I want is that the survivors who are not getting the response they should have from the places it should come will find that there are places of compassion and accompaniment and honesty in the church. So that's the other thing that will be a priority, because that bigger struggle of us all changing, us all learning, of our office holders learning has a long way to run yet. And when they do change, it's not always visible to us. I think that's really difficult, that. But I think I want to salute your courage in keeping on putting the challenge, because you might have more impact than you know. I think we can hope and pray for that. So,
well, I hope so. The last thing is, I've taken this one step above my bishop. I know there is no hierarchy, but on faith and morals, the local archbishop has a duty to speak to the bishop. Now, even the archbishop has now come back to me and said, unless you have a categorical disclaimer from the survivor who has walked away from the church, he's not interested in the church. He's failed to get the compensation he felt he needed. He doesn't want it, but I want to change. So the archbishop has said, I won't talk to you unless you come along with appropriate GDPR exclusion.
Yeah, and that happens often. I mean, I completely understand survivors walking away. Why wouldn't they? And yes, that's just an example of the clash between good practices in the kind of secular world, in things like GDPR, and this burning desire in the church to reach out and engage. That just shows the complexity of how our failures mesh together and multiply. So, yeah, we don't have easy answers to that. We were doing research about the way upstream issues that got us into this kind of cultural, these areas of difficulty where we're lacking both the competence and the skills and the confidence and honesty that's going to, that should be characterizing how all of this happens. So I'm just sorry to hear that.
Several years ago, she says, one of the parishes I was in, there was an accusation against the parish priest, and granted, police arrived, arrested him, and it just appeared naturally. There was a new priest very quickly put into place, and it was probably about nearly 10 days before anybody did any discussion. But by this time, it was all in the local papers, and the conversations going around. Priest was very, very active within the primary school, but the problems it caused was we were told in no uncertain terms where we had to discuss it among ourselves, among the children, any media, etc. And we were just to accept, and somebody would eventually get in touch with us now further down the line. The hassle this caused among all the parishioners, because there was a crowd that supported the parish priest, and the crowd who believed, now she says, and wanted to wait to see what was happening. The couple of people who had made accusations lived in the village, she says, so that didn't help. She says, because their family members were also naturally enough want to support their family friend. And this animosity went on for years and years. And the priests that had been accused, he eventually went away to Ireland, and she says, but he lived in Ireland then for the next X amount of years. She says, and he just died there kind of last year. But my children are now 40, and they were in primary school when this happened. And that's how much that animosity is still goes on. They talk about them, and they talk about how people didn't trust them, and they caused them to get taken away. But it put an awful position onto the new parish priest that came in, because he kept getting told, he wasn't to discuss it.
Mm.
And even the things that were then coming out, she says, and the children were concerned, they all loved this priest.
Mm. Yeah.
He was a priest, she says, who went into the primary school to hear confessions, was right across the road, lovely man, and he used to put the children to sit up on his knee to hear confessions. They were in the library room. The teachers all knew about it. But the strange thing is, none of us parents knew this is how he heard confession in the school.
Mm.
And once we started talking to the children didn't seem to think that was any kind of strange or weird or funny or no, it wasn't acceptable. And as you said, it's a kind of hidden thing. The teachers knew this was happening and they never done anything about it or raised concerns with even him or with other parents. So that then also had a big impact on the parish community. And it really, really did cause awful, awful problems.
Yeah. Thank you, Hon. I mean, I think I just want to recognise that there are quite a number of parishes around that carry this wound from decades ago.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, it's responsible for some people giving up on the church. I mean, I went to visit a parish where they only discovered some 10 or 12 years ago about a priest involved in a lot of abuse some 30 years ago. So they're having to look back and ask now, was it my child? Did I know anything? He married me, he baptized my children, and asked the questions, how do I feel about that? So, and I think this is, I mean, Clare talked about the conversional justice and a second wave of what's needed. And part of it, to my mind, is this recognizing all these kind of hidden wounds in parish communities. You know, it's right that victims and survivors have the first place in our concerns, but a second place is to acknowledge that the parish communities are carrying this, I mean, and hidden pain and distress about this, because it's hidden, is even more insidious. But the only thing I'd say, you know, because I don't have any easy answers to any of this, we're involved in much bigger change processes. I think even decades on, it's still possible to do activities that heal. This parish I visited had just done their own version of Loud Fence, this project where you build a wall of ribbons and have a special service and invite people to tie messages, and people can come and tie ribbons to express their own abuse or to express grief, and it's just a kind of it's a healing moment for where people can have a voice without having to make it visible or identifiable. And I think we have to dream up more things like this, which will create opportunities for people even now to say how bad they feel about something that might have happened 20 or 30 years ago, and see what conversations emerge from that. And I wish the other thing we have, and I think that the safeguarding agencies are just too busy with their primary job. And so my question is, whose job is it to create the kind of spaces where parish communities can come together and talk about how to do this? I mean, I know one parish that are looking for other parishes to talk to, and I don't really know where to point them because there's no forum for it. So it's just building an awareness of, we have some tasks we've barely begun yet. Clare, sorry, I'm talking too much. Do you want to add anything? I know we're
not at all.
time now.
And I kind of and I do agree with everything you said, and I think both with Patrick's and Honor's complicated stories. I mean, one of the phrases you used that Pat used was not Pat Jones, Patrick, was, how do you get round this? And a bit of me is like, we can't, you know. I mean, there are some really intractable, painful situations which are, but that doesn't mean we can't respond to them. But we can't just they're not simply solvable. Or so, you know, some of those healing things that you're talking about there, I think are significant, and seeking out where there are, and there absolutely are. There are moments of grace. There are places of help. There are places for healing, and I suppose part of what I hope the project going forward will do is actually bring those more and more to people's attention, so that they can be something that we can draw upon for that healing. The other thing that struck me and kind of moved me when Honor was speaking there, and you know, my kids are in their 30s in the main now, one in their 20s, and they often talk, survivors, psychologists working with survivors will often talk about how the trauma that is experienced by the survivor will be, where it unintentionally will have a generational effect. It will be passed down in one way or another. Even, in the best possible scenarios, it can't just be contained. And I think one thing that you're drawing our attention to in that story, Honor, is the way that what's happened in these incidents are not just individual cases. They actually have a generational effect and a cross-community effect. So it comes as no surprise to me, although it's a deeply sad thing, that still those things are having an effect on not just your children in their 40s, but actually subconsciously even on their children as well. That this is something that isn't, and I don't know that our leadership have fully got their heads around that yet.
I don't. It could, because naturally enough, it raised the whole story again whenever we heard of his death last year. Because then people were remembering, and as you say, and a lot of the animosity and anger came back then. I suppose some folk thought it had never ever been dealt with properly, and that there hadn't been a conclusion or again forgiveness or an apology. And I think that's been a big issue that, as you said, all this time later, it reared its head again among these local people.
It doesn't just go away.
And it's a trust you have in people. She said, I know we've been talking about the church now, but again, it's thinking who else all uses our halls and how and our facilities and the impact that might have.
No, listen, can I say a huge thanks to Dr. Pat and Professor Clare, sorry, just another chat just came into the box there. We do have unanswered questions, we've got comments, we've got a whole list of things that people would like to look at for the webinar next week. So I'll liaise with Pat and Clare behind the scenes to make sure that the questions that haven't been answered and the comments that haven't been responded to, we can cover in more depth next week. Thank you all so much for joining us, especially thank you to Pat and Clare, and hopefully we will see many of you back here, same time, same place, next week. Thank you very much.